Thank you for that kind introduction and for President Gerber and Ambassador Furr's words as well. I think they set a great scene for what I'm going to talk about, which is partnerships for sustainable finance from IFC's perspective. First, we'll run a quick video just to make sure everyone's awake and tell you a little story about one project that we've worked on that really captures what it takes in terms of partnerships to really solve tough problems.
Maintenant, cette année, pour avoir 40 tonnes même, c'est difficile. Puisque cette année, en tout cas, rien n'a donné. Le coton, le maïs, tout, rien n'a donné à cause de la mauvaise pluviométrie. À cause de la mauvaise pluviométrie, là, bon, il y en a même qui n'ont pas attendu la fin des récoltes et ils sont allés dans les sites miniers pour chercher de l'or, pour pouvoir se nourrir.
Le changement climatique est une réalité en Afrique, donc notamment au Burkina Faso. Donc, ces dernières années sont marquées par une récurrence des poches de sécheresse et également nous avons une récurrence des événements extrêmes. Nous avons des pluies de plus en plus violentes. Et donc dans le cadre de ce projet, nous proposons de réaliser des cordons pierreux. Donc ce sont des ouvrages anti-érosifs et également dans le cadre de ce projet, nous allons réaliser également des bassins de collecte des eaux de ruissellement.
En leur permettant d'améliorer la fertilité de leurs parcelles et d'assurer une irrigation d'appoint toutes les fois que cela s'avérera nécessaire.
This is just one example of the public and private sector working together to solve a global challenge. And when I think about these farmers and this project in Burkina Faso, it makes me think of Steve Jobs. Many of you have heard of Steve Jobs, I'm sure, and some of you may have read one of the biographies that is out about him. When Steve Jobs looked at this instrument, which is in my hand, and many of you might be looking at yours right now, he didn't see a phone like most of us saw 10 or 15 years ago. He saw a movie theater, he saw an atlas, he saw a camera, and of course he saw a phone. But I think this is the kind of, they called it in one of the biographies, a lightning moment, where someone sees something that everybody else sees, but they see it differently in a way that offers opportunity. And I think when we look at what happened in Burkina Faso, people saw an increasing problem for these farmers. And yet, I think the partnership between IFC and the private sector, both international finance and local finance, saw an opportunity, both for the financial institutions to create an opportunity to support agriculture in a sustainable way for them and for the farmers, and to create an asset class of agribusiness loans in that market that hadn't existed before. I think when we look at what happened 2.5 years ago when the world endorsed the 2030 agenda and acknowledged the need to think differently about development, it's this kind of lightning moment that occurred. The UN, the multilateral development banks, the private sector, and the broader development community agreed in July 2015 in Addis Ababa that ending poverty, fighting inequality and injustice, and tackling climate change would require partnerships and new sources of finance. The adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals 2 months later created opportunities and laid out urgent challenges. It created opportunities for the private sector to step up. It created opportunities for them to think about how they might see this as a business opportunity instead of just a development challenge. The SDGs and the 2030 Agenda also created a pressing call for the development community to make the most of its resources by leveraging its own scarce funds and the limited official development assistance, or ODA, that was available to attract much needed financing from the private sector. And the world's development challenges, as Raymond mentioned, are just too vast to be addressed with ODA alone. The SDGs will require $7 trillion a year, $4 trillion for developing countries alone. And that far outstrips the amount of ODA available, which stands currently at $140 billion a year. In 1990, just to show the growth in private sector finance, ODA equaled foreign direct investment in developing countries. By 2015, FDI became 7 times the amount of ODA. Yet there are countries and sectors, especially in the toughest markets, facing the riskiest challenges, that have yet to benefit from foreign direct investment, yet to benefit from private sector finance or private sector solutions. So the goal from Addis was to move the needle from billions in ODA to trillions in investments of all kinds, public, private, national, and global. In the 2 years since the SDGs were adopted, the conversation has shifted from theoretical necessity to practical implementation of the goals. Extreme poverty has halved since the year 2000, which is an excellent result. And business, which represents 60% of GDP, 80% of inward capital flows, and 90% of jobs in developing countries, which President Gerber pointed to, business has been a critical part of this success in halving poverty. But the private sector can still play a greater role and a more constructive role in realizing growth and development opportunities. Increasingly, private sector companies are realizing this and realizing that sustainable development is strategic to the growth of their businesses and that their business models can be adapted to align commercial success and profitability with social benefits. In parallel, the global development community, and I'll speak a bit about IFC today since that's what I know best, but the global development community is now focusing on designing financial tools and platforms to mobilize private sector capital. And that's the primary challenge. How do we engage private capital, private solutions, private efficiency, private expertise? The stakes in confronting this challenge could not be higher. I think Jean-Daniel and Raymond referred to some of these issues, and the consequences of not addressing the toughest development challenges are too severe to contemplate. Just consider the world's current state and the anticipated impact of increased urbanization, population growth, especially in the poorest areas, worsening conflict and instability, extreme weather, and continued climate change. In 2013, nearly 766 million people lived in poverty, extreme poverty. It was 11% of the global population. Today, 1.2 billion people lack electricity. 400 million people can't get access to essential health services, and 121 million children aren't in school. The number of people living in slums is expected to rise to 2 billion by 2030. 700 million people lack adequate water services. Extreme weather pushes another 26 million people into poverty every year. Africa alone will need 1.8 million jobs per month for its young and employable population to 2030. The stakes are especially high in fragile and conflict-affected countries where more than half the world's poor will be living in 2030. Unfortunately, in these markets, investable opportunities are very difficult to find and in most cases don't exist. IFC is uniquely placed with our partners to help deliver on this 2030 agenda. We are the largest development agency focused solely on the private sector, and we've been doing this work now for more than 60 years. We work with more than 2,000 businesses worldwide, using our capital and our experience and our influence to create markets and opportunities in the toughest regions of the world. In fiscal 17, we delivered a record $19 billion in long-term financing for developing countries. But the scale of the challenges and the ambition of these sustainable development goals are bigger than what we can alone do in the poor countries. And they're requiring us to come up with a new strategic framework, a new way to work. And this new strategy that we've adopted is designed for moving to respond to opportunities that appear to us, to more proactively and leverage the strengths of our whole World Bank group, the public and private sector, to go out and create those opportunities for the private sector to play a role. Creating markets, as we call it, hinges on working with governments to enact reforms that spur investment, finding new ways to de-risk investments and utilize tools such as blended finance, and adopting decision-making principles that put the private sector financing option first, instead of thinking always of a public solution to the problems in these tough markets. Put simply, creating markets means enabling the development of new markets and pushing for systemic changes to markets that have the potential to deliver sustainable impact and to put into action sustainable finance. We are trying to think beyond individual projects and more about investments that are scalable and resilient. Let me give you an example of work we've done to create markets in Colombia, where poor infrastructure has slowed economic growth for decades. IFC advised the Colombian government on its fourth-generation road program, which was designed to build 8,000 kilometers of roads across the country. We helped structure the first 3 transactions under the program, but for Colombia, the cost of financing the entire 8,000 kilometers was seen by some as prohibitive, $25 billion over 7 years. So IFC helped the government find innovative ways to attract long-term financing, creating a framework so institutional investors could venture into what for many had been uncharted territory, greenfield infrastructure investments. Colombia partnered with IFC to create FDN, a financial institution that catalyzes investment in Colombian infrastructure and addresses market failures that had previously limited infrastructure financing in the country. FDN became one of the first financiers of the road program. We then worked together with the government to leverage new local capital market regulations that made it easier for pension funds to invest in infrastructure projects. These regulations were developed with support from our sister organization, the World Bank. And this new regulatory framework in place helped launch one of the first infrastructure debt funds the country had ever seen, opening a path for pension funds to invest in the crucial road sector. This kind of work to create a market has happened over the years with IFC and the World Bank, but now what we're trying to do is to make this the systematic way we do business every day. Another part of IFC's approach is implementing a private sector first lens to all our work at the World Bank Group. It means that when we look at a project, we first ask, can the private sector financing pay for this project alone? And if not, we try to identify why not. Is it a policy issue? Do we need to engage the government or the World Bank to advise the government on policy reform? And if that doesn't seem to be the issue, would it make sense to work with public-private finance, where we use blended finance and other tools? And only if that fails or seems like it won't work, would we then say, okay, let's use our really precious public sector finance to try to solve the project's problem and the market's problem. And we call this approach maximizing finance for development, and it will be essential to solving the SDGs, in our opinion. One more recent innovation that will be especially important is what we call the Anticipated Impact Measurement Monitoring Framework, or AIM for short. And what that is a tool to help us track our impact. Because for years we've been tracking our IRRs, our RAROCs, our financial returns. But what we realize is we, as investors, we need numbers to track our development returns as well. The new system will allow IFC to do something it has not routinely done before. It will allow us to use this AIM tool to select projects for their systemic market impacts, as well as the impact of the individual project. It will help us to articulate how our work makes a difference, and it will allow us to weigh an intervention's relative contributions to sustainable finance and sustainable markets. And it will strengthen our ability to select and design projects and to maximize our impact. So add to the project's potentially advisory components or other components that might make the project more impactful to the overall market instead of just a standalone one intervention that does some good. All of this work takes partnerships, and some of our most important partners are in the room today. IFC has had a long and effective relationship with the Swiss government and businesses. Switzerland, and in particular SECO, has been a vital contributor to IFC's advisory services programs over many decades. Swiss support was instrumental in establishing IFC's corporate governance standards and the EDGE Green Building Code for emerging markets, for example. IFC's active investments and companies domiciled in Switzerland amounts to about $1.3 billion, our fourth largest investment portfolio with Western European clients. Swiss businesses are active globally, and they understand that there are amazing opportunities in emerging markets for their bottom lines, for their brands, for their clients, for their employees, given the value that Swiss citizens place on environmental and social sustainability. Recently, we've undertaken a few notable projects with Swiss investors in the cocoa and coffee sectors. These initiatives will help smallholder farmers and businesses improve their access to finance and boost competitiveness, including in some tough markets. In Côte d'Ivoire, for example, we worked with Barry Kayobo on a risk-sharing facility that will support more than 100,000 farmers by increasing revenues and strengthening the cocoa value chain. And in Kenya and Ethiopia, IFC invested in Nespresso's Sustainability Innovation Fund, which will help up to 40,000 rural coffee farmers boost productivity and improve the quality of their product in a climate-smart way. A SECO IFC initiative has also created markets for leasing operations across several regions. In Africa, together with SECO, we created the Africa Leasing Facility, which has assisted governments in 24 African countries to improve leasing laws and regulations. This makes it easier for small businesses to use leases to get access to finance for their expansion. This creates a market for small businesses to thrive. This creates jobs. And the facility has already worked with more than 6,500 small businesses and facilitated $57 million worth of business. The work on Africa leasing builds on the pioneering leasing work we did with SECO earlier in the former Soviet Union. These new platforms and the sharpened focus on difficult markets is delivering results at a time when investors are finding increased opportunities in developing countries. Consider the opportunities in climate-smart investments. The financing required for transition to a low-carbon, resilient global economy is counted in the trillions. This opens enormous opportunities for scaling climate-smart financing. An IFC report launched last year found that the Paris Climate Agreement opened up nearly $23 trillion in opportunities for climate-smart investments in emerging markets between now and 2030. And based on the national climate change commitments and underlying policies of 21 emerging market economies, the study identified sectors in each region, such as climate-resilient infrastructure in South Asia, clean energy in Africa, renewable energy, energy storage, green buildings, and sustainable urban transport. Infrastructure is another area where the needs are huge, but investors need new platforms and approaches to risk in order to get involved. The world will require about 90 trillion in infrastructure over the next 15 years, most of it in low and middle income countries. To support expected economic growth rates, the McKinsey Global Institute calculated that at least 60% of infrastructure spending needs to be directed towards the emerging markets. The gap between actual and required spending on ports, roads, power station, and other drivers of growth continues to widen. At the same time, it's estimated that of the approximately $80 trillion administered by pension funds and insurance companies worldwide, only about 1% is invested in infrastructure, and very little of that in developing countries. That's why de-risking instruments are crucial. Another massive opportunity, addressing gender inequality. Global GDP could rise by up to $28 trillion by 2025 if women participated in the economy globally at the same rates as men do. Ending barriers for women in certain sectors could boost labor productivity by up to 25% in some economies. And we've seen research that firms with at least 30% female leaders had net profit margins of up to 6 percentage points higher than companies with no women in the top ranks. The International Labor Organization has said that if the labor participation gap between women and men were to be reduced globally by 25% by 2025, it could add $5.8 trillion to the global economy and boost tax revenues. Sustainable investors like Blue Orchard are addressing this concern, addressing this need with their funds overseas. To sum up the opportunities, the Business and Sustainable Development Commission, which is made up of representatives from the private and public sectors, as well as civil society, convened in 2016 with a focus on inspiring and mobilizing business leaders to align their companies with the Sustainable Development Goals. And they found that companies linking their business models toward achieving the global goals could open up market opportunities worth up to $12 trillion a year. That would represent around 10% of the world's projected GDP. I hope all these trillions of dollars are starting to get you interested in what IFC can do to help you attract them. Despite these opportunities, the private sector often does not invest in certain sectors or certain countries for a number of reasons, real or perceived. There are political uncertainties, there's poor macroeconomic management, there are regulatory issues. For infrastructure, there are concerns about the payment capacity of state-run off-takers. There are environment and social risks and reputation risks that prohibit people or give them pause before thinking about moving to these markets. So what IFC is trying to do is develop new products and new platforms that will allow us to partner more actively with the private sector to fulfill this agenda. In fact, the World Bank, working with the public sector, and IFC and MIGA is the political risk insurance arm of the World Bank Group, we see ourselves as a group as a de-risking machine. One of the new tools that we've put together as a group with support from our shareholders is $2 billion from the International Development Agency, which supports the poorest countries in the world. And the $2 billion is being taken from their annual fund or their annual or every 3-year fundraising to help de-risk private sector projects in the toughest markets. We call this the private sector window, and its purpose is to catalyze private investment where commercial solutions have not come to play in the past. And we looked at some of the key risks that commercial players see when they go into these markets, and the goal is to use this private sector window to try to cover some of these risks so that investors are more willing to come into the markets. One is local currency financing, especially for long-term infrastructure. The second is, again, for infrastructure, project-based guarantees, so that if you're selling power or water to a state off-taker that isn't creditworthy, these guarantees could support the project. And the third is limited blended finance, which can come into play if the overall cost of financing to cover the perceived risk or the actual risk is going to make the project unviable on the ground for the local people. And we're creating new platforms to mobilize more capital for investors who don't have the resources themselves to do individual project due diligence. Through what we call the Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Program, or MCPP, we've created an emerging market loan portfolio for institutional investors that mirrors IFC's own debt investments. The portfolio is constructed following a passive and rules-based allocation process where an investor is offered a portion of each new eligible loan that IFC makes. Under this program, which has so far raised $6 billion, investors receive priority access to IFC's pipeline and benefit from IFC's experience in managing emerging market loans, and then gets to benefit from the same terms and conditions which IFC has. And IFC's investment will be in a first loss position subordinated to other senior investors. The risk position of the senior investors then gives them what is akin to an investment grade asset. And many institutional investors are, as you know, are limited by their investment guidelines or by regulation in their home countries as to what type of rating they can achieve. So we're trying to create these platforms where we can bridge that gap between what they need in an investment asset and what exists in the places that need the financing the most. This effort builds on the pioneering work of the IFC Asset Management Company, or AMC, which manages 13 investment funds for nearly $10 billion since it was established in 2009. We're also developing tools to mobilize capital for climate finance for the opportunities that I mentioned earlier. IFC and Amundi, a leading European asset manager, are creating the largest green bond fund dedicated to emerging markets. It's a $2 billion initiative that aims to deepen local capital markets and expand financing for climate investments. The Amundi Planet Emerging Green 1 Fund, which will be managed by Amundi, will start investing in just a few months in green bonds issued by banks in emerging markets. As Raymond mentioned earlier, SECO is discussing supporting this effort on the advisory side. IFC will invest up to $325 million and provide first loss coverage to lower the risk and to catalyze private capital into the funds. This fund, it's a milestone in terms of green finance. It demonstrates how international organizations can work together to mobilize investors to meet the world's climate objectives, both public institutions and private institutions. You'll hear more about Amundi today from my colleague, Jean-Marie Masse, when he's on a panel later. We're excited about all of this work and about our new strategy, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have about them. I am confident that together we can achieve the SDGs, but it will take deep and lasting partnerships between governments, donors, the private sector, international organizations, and civil society. We have seen great progress in the past 2.5 years since the 2030 agenda was agreed. Much more needs to be done, and at a much accelerated pace. I come back to Steve Jobs and my phone. We need to look at global issues and problems differently, to see opportunities for our investment dollars and for sustainable finance, to shape what our world will look like in the future. Thank you.